They told James Porter the rusted destroyer escort sitting in a Baltimore salvage yard was worthless except for scrap metal. Maybe $20,000 if he was lucky enough to find a buyer willing to haul away 3,000 tons of corroded steel that had been deteriorating since 1968. But when he climbed into the sealed cargo hold 3 weeks after inheriting the vessel from an uncle he'd never met, he found weapons-grade plutonium worth $40 million on the black market, classified documents explaining why it had been hidden there for 56 years, and a letter from his uncle revealing that preventing nuclear terrorism had required him to steal from the United States Navy and live the rest of his life knowing that doing the right thing had made him a federal criminal. Poor veteran inherited a 1960s Navy ship and the hidden cargo was worth $40 million. $40 million in deadly material that would connect him to a theft that had been covered up for decades and expose a conspiracy that reached from Cold War weapons programs to modern terrorism threats that intelligence agencies still hadn't neutralized. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, smash that subscribe button right now and tell us what state you're watching from in the comments. We love hearing from our viewers. Now let's get started. James Porter was 43 years old and living on disability payments from the Veterans Administration after an IED in Afghanistan had destroyed his left leg and most of his savings during the medical recovery that followed. He'd served 8 years in the Army as a combat engineer before the injury ended his military career, and he'd spent the 5 years since trying to build a life that didn't feel like a constant struggle against debt and depression, and the reality that his most valuable skills involved clearing minefields and building fortifications in war zones where people were actively trying to kill him. The inheritance notification arrived on a Tuesday in March, a certified letter from an attorney in Baltimore explaining that Edward Porter, James's paternal uncle, had died at 89 years old and had left his entire estate to James despite the fact that they'd never met, and James hadn't even known Edward existed until the lawyer's letter explained their family connection. The estate consisted primarily of one asset, a decommissioned destroyer escort named USS Reynolds that Edward had purchased at government auction in 1973 and had kept in a Baltimore salvage yard for the past 51 years, paying storage fees that had consumed most of his modest pension but apparently never attempting to sell or scrap the vessel. The attorney's letter was clinical and brief, explaining that Edward's estate had approximately $14,000 remaining after settling debts and paying for cremation, that the USS Reynolds was legally James's property, along with whatever value it might have as scrap metal, and that the salvage yard was requesting immediate resolution because storage fees were accumulating at $600 per month and would eventually consume the remaining estate funds if James didn't take possession or arrange for the vessel's disposal. James drove to Baltimore the following week, making the 7-hour trip from his apartment in Richmond in a truck that burned oil and had a check engine light that had been illuminated for the past 18 months. The salvage yard was in an industrial area near the waterfront, surrounded by chain-link fence and filled with the hulks of dead ships that had once been vital and powerful, but were now just rusting metal waiting to be cut apart and recycled. The yard manager, a man in his 60s named Frank DeLuca, met James at the gate with keys and paperwork and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting years for someone to finally claim the destroyer escort that had been occupying valuable space since before Frank had even started working there. "Your uncle was a strange guy," Frank said as they walked through rows of derelict vessels toward where the Reynolds sat in dry dock, its hull supported by massive wooden cradles that probably hadn't been moved since the ship had arrived. Paid his storage fees religiously for 51 years, never missed a payment but never came to visit the ship either. Just sent checks every month like clockwork and ignored every attempt we made to contact him about selling or scrapping it. "Did he say why he kept it?" James asked, looking at the destroyer escort as it came into view. A vessel about 300 feet long with a gray hull that was streaked with rust and a superstructure that had been stripped of most equipment during the Navy's decommissioning process in the late 1960s. Never explained anything. Frank unlocked a gate that led to the Reynolds' dry dock area, said it was personal and that he'd deal with it eventually, but eventually never came. "Now it's your problem, and I'll be honest with you. The ship's not worth much. Maybe $20,000 for scrap metal if you can find a buyer willing to transport it to a facility that can handle vessels this size. Anything valuable was removed before the Navy auctioned it in '73. They climbed aboard using a gangway that creaked under their weight, the destroyer escort's deck slippery with accumulated grime and bird droppings. Frank handed James the keys and a thick folder containing the ship's documentation, original purchase papers from 1973, showing Edward had paid $38,000 for a vessel that had cost the Navy millions to build in 1944. Most of the interior is gutted, Frank explained. No engines, no weapon systems, all the electronics were stripped out. Basically just a steel hull with some compartments that might have historical value but no practical use. James walked through the ship for an hour after Frank left, exploring cramped corridors and empty compartments that still smelled like oil and rust, and the peculiar metallic scent of old military vessels. Most spaces were indeed empty, equipment removed and bulkheads stripped, but in the forward section below the waterline he found a compartment that was sealed differently from others, its hatch welded shut and painted over multiple times in a way that suggested someone had wanted to ensure it stayed closed. He returned the next day with cutting equipment borrowed from the salvage yard, spending 3 hours carefully cutting through welds that had been professionally done by someone with training and skill. The hatch finally opened with a metallic groan, revealing darkness and stale air that hadn't circulated in decades. James's flashlight beam revealed a space about 15 feet by 20 feet, and inside were items that absolutely should not have been on a decommissioned destroyer escort sitting in a civilian salvage yard. Metal containers marked with radiation symbols and Department of Energy identification codes sat secured to the deck with chains that had been professionally installed. Beside them were filing cabinets containing documents in protective sleeves, and on top of one cabinet was an envelope addressed in neat handwriting. To whoever inherits this ship and finds this compartment, I'm sorry for the burden I'm passing to you, but someone needs to know the truth about what happened in 1968 and why I've kept this material hidden for 56 years. Your uncle, Edward Porter. James opened the envelope with hands that had started shaking, his combat veteran's instincts screaming that radiation symbols meant danger and that whatever was in those metal containers was something he should not be handling without proper protection and expertise. The letter inside was 5 pages long, dated 3 months ago, written by a man who knew he was dying and wanted to explain crimes and secrets and impossible choices to a nephew he'd never met, but hoped would understand. My name is Edward Porter, the letter began. I was a nuclear weapons technician in the United States Navy from 1963 to 1972, specializing in the handling and maintenance of tactical nuclear warheads deployed on submarines and surface vessels. In October 1968, I discovered that weapons-grade plutonium from a decommissioned warhead had been stolen by a weapons officer who planned to sell it to a foreign buyer, likely Soviet agents operating in the United States. I recovered the material before the sale could happen, but I couldn't report the theft through official channels because doing so would have revealed security failures that the Navy was desperate to hide and would have resulted in my own prosecution for handling classified materials without authorization. James read the entire letter standing in that sealed compartment, learning about his uncle's impossible situation, about plutonium that could have been used to build dirty bombs or actual nuclear weapons, about a conspiracy that had reached high enough in the Navy that reporting it properly would have been career suicide and possibly actual suicide if the wrong people learned what Edward knew. The letter explained how Edward had hidden the material on the Reynolds, a destroyer escort he'd been assigned to during its final months of service before decommissioning, and how he'd purchased the ship at auction specifically to prevent anyone else from discovering what was hidden in the sealed compartment. For 56 years I've kept this material secure, Edward had written. For 56 years I've wondered if I made the right choice, if I should have reported the theft despite the consequences, if hiding plutonium that could kill thousands was justified by preventing my own prosecution and protecting Navy officials who would have destroyed my life to cover their failures. I don't know the answer to those questions, James, but I do know that this material is still dangerous, still valuable to terrorists who would pay millions for it, and still needs to be secured by someone who will do the right thing, even if the right thing means facing consequences I was too afraid to face myself. James climbed out of the compartment and sat on the Reynolds's deck, his mind struggling to process that he'd just inherited not just a worthless ship, but weapons-grade plutonium worth $40 million to the right buyers, stolen from the Navy in 1968, hidden by an uncle who'd spent 56 years paying storage fees to keep it secure, and now his responsibility to handle in ways that wouldn't get him killed or imprisoned or worse. His phone rang, startling him out of paralyzed shock. The caller ID showed a blocked number, and James answered to hear a voice he didn't recognize, male and professional, and somehow knowing things he shouldn't know. "Mr. Porter, this is someone who knows about your uncle's ship and what it contains. We need to meet immediately to discuss how to resolve this situation safely and profitably. Don't contact authorities, don't tell anyone what you found, and don't do anything stupid that gets people killed. We'll be in touch with meeting details within 24 hours. The line went dead before James could respond, and he sat staring at his phone, understanding that whoever had just called knew about the plutonium, had probably been monitoring the ship for years waiting for Edward to die, and was now moving to acquire material that was worth a fortune, and could kill thousands if it ended up in the wrong hands. James spent that night in a cheap motel near the salvage yard, his service pistol loaded and within reach, his mind racing through scenarios that all seemed to end badly regardless of which choice he made. He could call the FBI and report the plutonium, which would likely result in his arrest for possession of stolen nuclear material, even though he'd only inherited it hours ago. He could meet with whoever had called him and potentially negotiate a sale that would make him wealthy, but would also make him complicit in nuclear terrorism. Or he could try to handle this alone, which seemed impossible given that he had no expertise in nuclear materials and no resources beyond his disability check and a truck with a check engine light. His phone rang at 3 a.m., the same blocked number, and James answered immediately. The voice was different this time, female and carrying authority that suggested military or intelligence background. "Mr. Porter, my name is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations. I need you to listen very carefully because your life and potentially thousands of other lives depend on the decisions you make in the next 72 hours. James sat up in bed, his combat instincts suddenly sharp despite exhaustion. "How do you know about the plutonium? We've been monitoring that ship since 1994, when satellite surveillance detected radiation signatures that shouldn't exist on a decommissioned vessel sitting in a civilian salvage yard." Mitchell's voice was calm but urgent. "Your uncle was never prosecuted because we understood he was keeping the material secure rather than trying to profit from it. But now that he's dead and the ship has been inherited by someone we don't know, the situation has become critical. Multiple parties are aware of that plutonium, and some of them have resources and motivations that make them extremely dangerous." "Like whoever called me earlier today?" James asked. "That was likely representatives of a network that's been trying to acquire weapons-grade material for the past 20 years. They've attempted purchases from Russian facilities, Pakistani scientists, and North Korean operatives. They haven't succeeded yet, but your inheritance represents the best opportunity they've had, and they will kill you without hesitation if you don't cooperate or if they believe you're working with authorities." "So what am I supposed to do?" James demanded, anger cutting through his fear. "I inherited a ship I didn't ask for, found material I don't know how to handle, and now I'm caught between terrorists who want to buy it and a government that will probably prosecute me for possessing it. How is any of this fair?" "It's not fair," Mitchell agreed, "but fairness isn't relevant when we're discussing nuclear terrorism. What's relevant is securing that material before it falls into hands that will use it to build a dirty bomb or worse. I'm asking you to work with us, to let us guide you through a process that neutralizes the threat, while protecting you from prosecution and keeping you alive through what's going to be a very dangerous few days." James thought about his uncle's letter, about 56 years of keeping plutonium secure while paying storage fees and living with secrets that had isolated him from his family. "Why didn't you just seize the ship years ago? Why let my uncle keep the material if you knew it was there?" "Because we didn't know exactly where on the ship it was hidden, and conducting a thorough search would have required revealing that we knew about the theft, which would have exposed security failures that the Navy still prefers to keep classified." Mitchell paused. "Your uncle's solution wasn't ideal, but it was functional. He kept the material secure through decades when it could have been used for terrible purposes. Now you have an opportunity to finish what he started, to ensure that plutonium ends up properly secured instead of in the hands of people who will use it to kill innocents. And if I help you, what happens to me?" James pressed. "Do I get prosecuted for possessing stolen nuclear material? Do I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder worried about terrorists who want revenge? You get immunity from prosecution, witness protection if necessary, and compensation for your cooperation." Mitchell's tone softened slightly. "Mr. Porter, I know this isn't what you signed up for when you inherited your uncle's estate, but you're a combat veteran who understands duty and sacrifice. What I'm asking you to do is dangerous, but it's also the right thing. And sometimes that's the only justification we get for decisions that change our lives in ways we didn't choose. James walked to the motel window and looked out at the salvage yard visible in the distance, the Reynolds sitting dark and silent among other dead ships, containing material that could kill thousands if it reached the wrong buyers. What do you need me to do? First, you're going to meet with the people who called you earlier. You're going to tell them you're willing to sell the plutonium for $40 million, and you're going to negotiate delivery terms that give us time to set up an interdiction operation. Mitchell's voice became more formal, shifting into command mode. Second, you're going to wear a wire so we can monitor the negotiations and identify everyone involved in the network. Third, you're going to trust that we can protect you even though you have no reason to trust government promises after what happened to your uncle. What if they detect the wire? What if they realize I'm working with you and decide to kill me rather than risk exposure? Then you use the training you received in the Army and you survive long enough for our tactical teams to intervene. Mitchell didn't sugarcoat the danger. I'm not going to lie to you, Mr. Porter. This operation has significant risk, but the alternative is letting weapons-grade plutonium reach a terrorist network that's been trying to acquire it for 2 decades. And that's not an alternative I can accept. James made his decision in the silence that followed, thinking about IEDs in Afghanistan and the soldiers who died because insurgents had access to weapons and explosives that killed indiscriminately, thinking about his uncle who'd spent 56 years keeping dangerous material out of the wrong hands, thinking about the kind of person he wanted to be when faced with impossible choices that tested whether convenience or conscience would guide his actions. Where do we start? Mitchell gave him an address in Baltimore, a federal building where he'd meet the team that would prepare him for the negotiation and equip him with surveillance equipment that could survive detection sweeps. Come alone, tell no one where you're going, and assume you're being watched from the moment you leave that motel room. The people trying to acquire this plutonium are professionals who've evaded intelligence agencies for decades. They're smart, ruthless, and extremely dangerous. Don't underestimate them. James dressed quickly and checked out of the motel at 4 a.m., driving through empty Baltimore streets toward the address Mitchell had provided. His combat veteran instincts were screaming warnings about ambushes and surveillance, making him hyper-aware of every vehicle that seemed to follow too closely and every face that appeared in his rearview mirror. He'd spent 8 years in the Army learning to survive in hostile environments, but Afghanistan had been simple compared to this. Enemies wore uniforms and carried weapons openly, while here the threats were invisible and the rules of engagement were unclear. The federal building was secured and anonymous, the kind of place that could have contained any government agency or none, and Mitchell met him in a conference room that had been swept for electronic surveillance. She was younger than James had expected from her voice, maybe 45, with the bearing of someone who'd spent years in special operations before moving into intelligence work. Around the table sat 6 other people, 3 men and 3 women, all carrying themselves with the alert professionalism of people who dealt with national security threats daily. Mr. Porter, thank you for coming. Mitchell gestured to a chair. These are members of a joint task force that's been tracking the network trying to acquire your plutonium. We don't have much time, so I'm going to be direct. The people who contacted you yesterday will call again within the next 12 hours with meeting details. When they do, you'll agree to whatever they propose. You'll wear the equipment we're about to give you, and you'll follow the protocols we're about to teach you. Your job is simple. Be convincing, gather intelligence, and stay alive long enough for us to neutralize the threat. And if something goes wrong? James asked. If they detect the wire or figure out I'm cooperating with you? One of the other team members spoke, a man in his 30s with the intense focus of someone who'd conducted countless dangerous operations. Then you remember your combat training, and you do whatever's necessary to survive. We'll have teams positioned for rapid intervention, but there will be windows where you're alone with people who won't hesitate to kill you if they suspect betrayal. Your best protection is being so convincing that they never question whether you're legitimately trying to sell them plutonium worth $40 million. James thought about his uncle's letter, about the burden of keeping secrets and making choices that isolated you from everyone who should have been able to help. I need to know something first. If this operation succeeds, if we stop these people and secure the plutonium, what happens to my uncle's legacy? Does he get recognized for keeping this material secure for 56 years? Or does he get remembered as a thief who stole from the Navy? Mitchell's expression softened slightly. Your uncle made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. Official recognition isn't possible because acknowledging his actions would require revealing security failures the Navy still considers classified. But the people in this room know what he did, and we respect the sacrifice he made to keep dangerous material out of the wrong hands. That's the only recognition he'll ever receive, and sometimes that has to be enough. James nodded slowly, understanding that some acts of courage would never be publicly acknowledged, that some heroes would remain anonymous because revealing their actions would expose failures that institutions preferred to keep hidden. He thought about soldiers he'd served with in Afghanistan, men and women who'd done extraordinary things in circumstances that would never be fully explained or properly honored, and he understood that his uncle had been that kind of soldier, fighting a different kind of war in shadows where victory meant nothing worse happened and recognition was impossible. "All right," James said. "Tell me what I need to do to stop these people and make sure my uncle's 56 years of keeping that plutonium secure actually meant something." The call came 14 hours later, while James sat in a diner 3 blocks from the federal building, a plate of untouched food in front of him and the wire taped to his chest, feeling like it was burning through his skin even though Mitchell had assured him the equipment was undetectable. The blocked number appeared on his phone and James answered on the second ring, his voice steady despite adrenaline making his hands shake. "Mr. Porter." The voice was male, accent suggesting Eastern European origins, educated and professional in a way that made him more threatening rather than less. "I'm pleased you've been reasonable about your situation. We'd like to meet this evening to discuss terms and verify the material's authenticity before proceeding with financial arrangements." "Where and when?" James asked, following the script Mitchell's team had drilled into him during 8 hours of preparation that had covered everything from negotiation tactics to what to do if someone put a gun to his head. "There's an abandoned factory in the industrial district, address I'm texting you now. Come alone at 8 p.m. Bring documentation proving you have legal access to the ship, and understand that if we detect any surveillance or law enforcement presence, the meeting ends immediately, and you become a liability we'll eliminate." The man's tone remained professional even while delivering death threats. "This is business, Mr. Porter. We're willing to pay fair market value for material we need, but we're also prepared to take it by force if you prove uncooperative or foolish." The line disconnected, and James's phone buzzed with a text containing an address in an area of Baltimore that had been industrial in the 1960s, but was now mostly abandoned buildings waiting for redevelopment that never came. Mitchell's team had been monitoring the call through equipment that intercepted it before it reached James's phone, and within seconds, she was in the diner booth across from him with 2 other agents. "We know the location. Satellite imagery shows it's a factory that manufactured ship components until 1987. Mitchell pulled up building plans on a tablet. 3 stories, mostly open floor plan, multiple entry and exit points, which is good for our tactical teams but also means they'll have escape routes if things go wrong." She looked at James directly. "They'll sweep you for wires when you arrive. The equipment we gave you is designed to defeat standard detection, but if they're using military-grade scanners, there's a chance they'll find it." "Then what happens?" James asked, his combat veteran mind already planning for worst-case scenarios. "Then you have approximately 90 seconds before our teams breach the building. Your job is to stay alive during those 90 seconds, using whatever means necessary." One of the other agents slid a small device across the table, something that looked like a key fob. "This is a panic button. Press it and hold for 2 seconds, and every tactical unit within 3 miles gets an immediate breach order. But Mr. Porter, understand that once you press that button, we're committed to a confrontation that will likely involve gunfire and casualties. Only use it if you're absolutely certain the situation has gone beyond recovery." James pocketed the panic button and thought about IEDs in Afghanistan, about the seconds between recognizing a threat and responding to it, about how combat veterans learned to make life or death decisions with incomplete information and no time for analysis. "I've been in situations where 90 seconds felt like forever and situations where it felt like nothing. Which one is this going to be?" "Hopefully neither, because hopefully they won't detect the wire and we'll get the intelligence we need to identify the entire network before interdicting the sale." Mitchell's expression showed respect mixed with concern. "But if it becomes a 90-second situation, remember your training, and remember that backup is coming, even if it feels like you're alone." James spent the remaining hours before the meeting, reviewing building plans and rehearsing scenarios with Mitchell's team. learning sight lines and cover positions and extraction routes in case everything went wrong. By 7:30, he was driving toward the abandoned factory in his truck, very aware that multiple surveillance teams were tracking his movement and that tactical units were pre-positioning around the location. By 7:55, he was parking outside the factory entrance, seeing no other vehicles but knowing that meant nothing, because professionals wouldn't announce their presence with obvious transportation. He entered the building at precisely 8 p.m., his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that smelled like rust and old chemicals and abandonment. The voice came from above, somewhere on the second level where someone had positioned themselves with tactical advantage over the entrance. "Come up the stairs, Mr. Porter, slowly and with your hands visible. We're going to search you before we talk business." James climbed the metal staircase, each step echoing through the empty factory, his hands raised and his mind cataloging details that might matter if this situation deteriorated into violence. At the top of the stairs were 3 men, all wearing dark clothes and carrying themselves with the alert professionalism of people who'd done this kind of work many times. The one who'd given instructions stepped forward with a handheld scanner, beginning a sweep that would either miss the wire taped to James's chest or would detect it and turn this meeting into the kind of deadly confrontation that James had hoped to avoid. The scanner passed over James's torso twice, its operator frowning at readings that were apparently ambiguous or unexpected. "You're wearing something electronic," he said, his accent matching the voice from the phone call. "Either you're cooperating with law enforcement or you have a pacemaker or insulin pump. Which is it?" James thought fast, remembering the cover story Mitchell's team had prepared. "Left leg's prosthetic, battery-powered. Got blown up in Afghanistan. Been wearing this thing for 5 years. You want to see the scar tissue and the serial number stamped on the hardware?" The man studied James for a long moment before nodding. "Show me the documentation for the ship first. If it checks out, we'll discuss your prosthetic later." James pulled out papers Frank DeLuca had given him, legal documents proving he'd inherited the Reynolds and had authority to grant access or sell it. The man examined them carefully, while the other 2 kept positions that provided covering fire angles if this meeting turned hostile. Finally, he handed the documents back and extended his hand. "My name is Victor. You have something we want, and we have money you need. Let's discuss how to make this transaction benefit everyone involved." The negotiation lasted 90 minutes, Victor explaining that his organization needed weapons-grade material for purposes he wouldn't specify, but which James understood meant either dirty bombs or actual nuclear weapons. The price was $40 million, payment in cryptocurrency that couldn't be traced, and delivery would happen within 72 hours pending verification that the plutonium was authentic and sufficient quantity to justify the expense. "How do you verify authenticity?" James asked, wondering how Mitchell's team would handle inspectors accessing the Reynolds' sealed compartment. "We bring specialists with equipment to test radiation signatures and plutonium isotope ratios." Victor pulled out a tablet showing technical specifications that James didn't understand, but which presumably indicated what they were expecting to find. "If the material matches these parameters, we transfer the funds and remove it from the ship. If it doesn't match, we walk away and you keep your inheritance. Simple business transaction. And if I decide after verification that I don't want to sell," James pressed, "if I change my mind about putting nuclear material in the hands of people who probably plan to kill thousands with it?" Victor's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his eyes. "Then you become a problem that needs solving, and problems get solved permanently in our line of work. But I don't think you'll change your mind, Mr. Porter. I think you're a disabled veteran living on government checks that don't cover your expenses, and I think $40 million sounds better than poverty and debt for the rest of your life. Greed is reliable, which is why we're having this conversation instead of just taking what we want by force." The meeting ended with plans for Victor's specialist to access the ship the following evening, James providing keys and security codes for the salvage yard, while trying not to think about the fact that he was helping terrorists get closer to material that could kill thousands. He drove away from the factory knowing that surveillance teams were tracking Victor and his associates, knowing that Mitchell's team had recorded everything and would be analyzing it for intelligence about the network's structure and capabilities. Back in the Federal Building's conference room, Mitchell played back the recording while her team identified voices and cross-referenced them with databases of known operatives. Victor is actually Viktor Petrov, former Soviet military intelligence, been on watch lists since 1994 for attempting to acquire weapons-grade materials. She pulled up files showing a man in his 50s with the kind of history that made him extremely dangerous. The other two men are unidentified, but their accents suggest Chechen or Georgian origins, possibly connected to networks that have been trying to rebuild after counterterrorism operations degraded their capabilities over the past decade. So what happens tomorrow when they come to verify the plutonium? James asked. Do we let them access the compartment, or do we interdict before they reach the ship? We let them verify because verification means they bring equipment and specialists we haven't identified yet, and those specialists will lead us to more of the network. Mitchell's expression was grim. I know it feels wrong to let terrorists get that close to nuclear material, but if we interdict too early, we only catch the people we already know about while the rest of the network adapts and finds other sources. We need to dismantle the entire operation, which means letting them proceed until we've identified everyone involved. James thought about his uncle's letter, about 56 years of keeping secrets and living with consequences, about the burden of knowing that doing the right thing sometimes meant accepting terrible risks because the alternative was worse. How many more people are we talking about? How deep does this network go? Intelligence suggests at least 20 operatives across 6 countries, with funding sources we haven't fully traced. Mitchell showed him organizational charts with faces and names, some confirmed and others suspected. This isn't just Victor and his team. This is an infrastructure that's been built over decades specifically to acquire materials and expertise for nuclear terrorism. Taking down the whole network means preventing future attacks beyond just this one. Then I'll help you get them all, James decided. My uncle spent 56 years keeping that plutonium secure. Another 72 hours to make sure these people never get access to any nuclear material seems like a reasonable extension of his mission. Victor arrived at the salvage yard the following evening with 2 additional people. Neither Mitchell's team nor intelligence databases could immediately identify a man and woman in their 40s carrying equipment cases that sophisticated radiation detectors suggested contained genuine plutonium testing gear rather than props or decoys. James met them at the gate with Frank DeLuca, who'd been briefed by Mitchell's team and agreed to cooperate despite visible nervousness about having potential terrorists on his property, examining material that could destroy Baltimore if mishandled or detonated. Mr. Porter, Victor said with professional courtesy that felt somehow more menacing than open hostility. These are my technical specialists, Dr. Kovalenko and Dr. Amati. They'll need approximately 2 hours to conduct their assessment. I trust you'll provide full access to the sealed compartment and will not interfere with their work. James led them to the Reynolds, very aware that tactical teams were positioned throughout the salvage yard with orders to intervene immediately if the situation became hostile, or if the specialists attempted to remove any material before the planned interdiction. The wire he wore had been upgraded to equipment that would transmit even if jamming was attempted, and the panic button in his pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric with the weight of responsibility it represented. Dr. Kovalenko, a man with Russian accent and the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades handling dangerous materials, examined the sealed compartment with professional interest that bordered on excitement. This is exceptional preservation, he said to Victor while unpacking equipment. If the material inside has been maintained in this environment for 56 years, isotope degradation should be minimal. We may be looking at weapons-grade plutonium that's actually superior to what we'd acquire from less secure sources. Dr. Amati, whose accent suggested Iranian origins despite the obviously assumed name, began setting up radiation detection equipment that would analyze signatures without requiring the containers to be opened immediately. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times, and James wondered how many other attempts to acquire nuclear material she'd participated in and how many had succeeded before intelligence agencies had identified and stopped them. The testing process was meticulous and technical, the 2 specialists discussing isotope ratios and radiation signatures in language that James didn't fully understand, but which Mitchell's team was certainly recording and analyzing through the wire he wore. After 90 minutes, Dr. Kovalenko looked at Victor with an expression that mixed satisfaction and concern. The material is authentic weapons-grade plutonium, approximately 8.3 kilograms, sufficient for a single nuclear device or multiple dirty bombs depending on intended application. However, there's something unusual about the documentation. What kind of unusual? Victor asked, his tone sharpening. These containers have Department of Energy codes from 1968, but the plutonium itself shows production signatures from 1963 to 1965. Dr. Kovalenko pulled out papers from one of the filing cabinets. According to these records, this material was originally designated for tactical warheads deployed on submarines, but it was diverted from the weapons assembly facility before incorporation into actual devices. Someone intercepted this plutonium between production and deployment, which means there should be military investigations and inquiries that we're not seeing in these documents. What are you saying? James asked, genuinely confused. My uncle's letter said he recovered this after a weapons officer stole it from a decommissioned warhead. Are you telling me that's not what happened? Dr. Ahmadi spoke for the first time, her voice carrying professional assessment rather than emotion. What happened is more complex than simple theft. This plutonium was diverted during the production phase, before it ever reached weapons systems. The theft your uncle discovered in 1968 was actually the second theft. Someone stealing material that had already been stolen years earlier and hidden in ways that suggest cooperation from people with significant authority within the weapons program. Victor's expression had shifted from satisfaction to calculation, understanding that the material's history created complications that affected its value and the risks involved in acquiring it. This suggests counterintelligence operations that may still be active. If this plutonium was part of an ongoing investigation when it was stolen the second time, there could be monitoring and tracking systems we haven't detected. James felt cold despite the Baltimore evening heat, understanding that his uncle's letter had contained only part of the truth, that Edward Porter had recovered stolen material without realizing it had been stolen before, and that the conspiracy reached deeper into military and intelligence systems than anyone had suspected. Is the material still valuable? James asked. Does this history change whether you want to proceed with the purchase? It changes our timeline and our precautions, Victor replied. We'll need to move the material immediately after payment, rather than waiting for arranged transportation. We'll also need additional verification that this salvage yard and the ship haven't been under surveillance by parties we haven't identified. He looked directly at James with an intensity that suggested he was reassessing everything about the transaction. Mr. Porter, has anyone else approached you about this plutonium? Any government agencies or intelligence services expressing interest in the material or in your uncle's history? James thought about Mitchell's instructions to be convincing, to provide intelligence that would identify the network's full scope, to stay in character as a disabled veteran desperate for money who'd stumbled into something much larger than he understood. No government contact, he lied smoothly. Just you and your organization. Why would intelligence agencies care about material that's been sitting in a salvage yard for 56 years? Because intelligence agencies have very long memories about nuclear materials they lost track of. Victor pulled out his phone and made a brief call in a language James didn't recognize, presumably reporting the verification results and the concerning history to whoever was coordinating the operation. After disconnecting, he turned back to James with a decision. We're proceeding with the purchase, but we're accelerating the timeline. Payment will transfer in 12 hours, and we'll remove the material immediately afterward. You'll need to ensure the salvage yard is accessible at 3 a.m. tomorrow, and you'll need to be present to authorize our team's access. 3 a.m. is pretty specific, James said. Any particular reason we're moving in the middle of the night? Because that's when satellite coverage of this area is minimal, and when law enforcement presence is lowest. Victor's tone made clear this wasn't negotiable. We've been planning this acquisition for months, Mr. Porter. Every detail has been considered and every risk assessed. The fact that you're asking questions about our operational security suggests either curiosity or cooperation with parties who've encouraged you to gather intelligence. Which is it? James felt the panic button in his pocket and knew that if he pressed it now, tactical teams would breach within 90 seconds, but Victor and the specialists might escape in the confusion, and the network would scatter before all members could be identified. It's curiosity from someone who spent 8 years in the Army learning that operations conducted at 3 a.m. usually involved either raids or disasters. I just want to make sure this transaction happens smoothly, and I get paid the $40 million we agreed on. Victor studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. You'll get paid, assuming you remain cooperative and don't develop conscience problems about what we're planning to do with this material. The money will transfer to the cryptocurrency wallet you provided, and you'll never hear from us again unless you do something stupid, like contacting authorities after the fact. Understood? Understood, James confirmed, watching as Victor, Kovalenko, and Ahmadi packed their equipment and prepared to leave the Reynolds with testing data that would presumably be verified independently before the final transaction. But as they were departing, Dr. Amati paused and looked back at the sealed compartment with an expression James couldn't quite read. "Your uncle must have been remarkable," she said quietly. "Keeping this secure for 56 years while knowing what it could be used for, paying storage fees that consumed his pension, living with secrets that isolated him from family. That's dedication to preventing harm that most people wouldn't have the strength to maintain." He was remarkable, James agreed. And he'd want to know that this material is being used in ways that don't hurt innocent people. Amati's expression shifted to something sad. "Then I'm sorry your uncle won't get what he wanted, because innocent people are exactly who will be hurt when we deploy devices built from this plutonium. This isn't about ideology or politics, Mr. Porter. This is about creating enough chaos and fear to achieve objectives that conventional terrorism can't accomplish. Your uncle kept this material safe for 56 years, and you're undoing his entire life's work for money you probably won't live long enough to spend." She left before James could respond, and Victor shot him a warning look that suggested discussing the network's intentions was outside the boundaries of their business relationship. James stood alone on the Reynolds' deck after they'd gone, the weight of Amati's words settling over him like physical pressure, understanding that he was helping facilitate exactly the kind of nuclear terrorism his uncle had spent his life preventing. Back in the Federal Building conference room, Mitchell played the recording of the verification while her team analyzed everything the specialists had said and done. "The fact that they identified the plutonium's unusual history is concerning," she said. "It suggests they have access to weapons program records that should be classified, which means either they have sources within current nuclear security infrastructure, or they've compromised historical archives that were supposed to be secure." "What about Dr. Amati's comments?" James asked. "She said innocent people would be hurt when they deploy devices built from this plutonium. That sounds like they have specific targets and timelines. We're analyzing her word choices for intelligence value." One of the other team members pulled up transcripts with highlighted sections. The phrase "deploy devices" plural suggests multiple attacks and achieve objectives that conventional terrorism can't accomplish. Implies they're trying to force policy changes or create chaos that serves strategic purposes beyond simply killing civilians. James thought about Afghanistan and IEDs that had killed soldiers and civilians indiscriminately, about the kind of people who built those bombs, and the ideology that made them believe murder was justified if it served larger goals. These people aren't going to stop even if we interdict tomorrow's transfer. They've been building this network for decades, and they'll keep trying until they succeed, or until we dismantle every operational cell. "Which is exactly why we're letting the transaction proceed," Mitchell confirmed. "Tomorrow at 3 a.m., Victor's team will arrive to remove the plutonium. We'll have tactical units positioned to interdict, but we're waiting until the last possible moment because intelligence suggests there are additional network members who'll only appear for the actual transfer. Once everyone's in position and committed, we execute simultaneous raids across 6 locations in 4 countries, rolling up the entire network in a coordinated operation that's been planned for years and is finally being triggered by your cooperation. And if something goes wrong, if they detect the tactical teams or if someone gets killed during the interdiction, then we adapt and respond using protocols that have been developed specifically for this scenario." Mitchell's expression was serious. "Mr. Porter, I'm not going to promise this operation will be clean or that everyone will survive. What I can promise is that the alternative, letting this network acquire nuclear material and deploy it against civilian targets, is unacceptable. Your uncle understood that 56 years ago when he chose to keep this plutonium secure despite personal cost. Now you're finishing what he started, and that matters more than whether the ending is neat or whether you get recognition for the sacrifice you're making." James nodded slowly, understanding that some stories didn't have Hollywood endings where heroes were celebrated and villains were punished and everything resolved perfectly. Some stories just had people making difficult choices in impossible circumstances and hoping the outcome justified the risks they'd accepted. The tactical teams moved into position at 2:15 a.m., 45 minutes before Victor's scheduled arrival, operators dressed in black and carrying weapons that were designed for close-quarters combat, in environments where nuclear material required extreme caution about stray rounds or explosions that might breach containers and release radiation. James sat in the salvage yard office with Mitchell and 2 other agents, watching multiple video feeds from cameras that had been installed throughout the facility during the previous 12 hours, every angle covered, and every escape route monitored by teams that had rehearsed this operation dozens of times. 3 vehicles approaching from the north. One of the communications specialists reported at 2:47 a.m. 2 vans and a truck, all matching descriptions from our surveillance. Thermal imaging shows approximately 12 individuals total, more than we expected based on previous estimates. That's double what Victor indicated would be necessary for material removal, Mitchell said, her expression tightening with concern. Either he's bringing additional security because he's suspicious, or there are network members we haven't identified who are using this transfer as an opportunity to meet in person. She made a decision quickly. All units hold positions. Let them enter the yard and begin loading procedures. We interdict only when everyone's committed and escape becomes difficult. James watched the vehicles pull through the salvage yard gate that Frank DeLuca had left unlocked per instructions, seeing armed men deploy with professional efficiency that spoke of military training and combat experience. Victor emerged from the lead van with Drs. Kovalenko and Amati, all 3 moving toward the Reynolds while the additional personnel established perimeter security that would make interdiction more complicated and potentially more violent than originally planned. They're setting up for extended occupation rather than quick extraction, one of the tactical commanders observed. That perimeter positioning suggests they're planning to spend at least 30 minutes on site, possibly longer if they're conducting additional verification before loading, which gives us more time to identify everyone present, but also more time for something to go wrong, Mitchell replied. She turned to James. When Victor calls you to authorize access, you need to sound natural and unconcerned. Any indication that you're nervous or compromised and this situation deteriorates before we're ready to execute. James's phone rang at 2:53. Victor's voice professional and businesslike. Mr. Porter, we're at the ship. Please come verify our access and ensure your salvage yard contact doesn't interfere with our work. On my way, James said, standing and checking the panic button in his pocket one final time. Mitchell nodded once and James left the office knowing that tactical teams were tracking his movement and that the next 30 minutes would determine whether Victor's network was dismantled or whether nuclear material ended up in the hands of terrorists who would use it to kill thousands. Walking across the salvage yard toward the Reynolds felt surreal, distant floodlights casting shadows that made the destroyer escort look like a ghost ship from another era, and James thought about his uncle who'd spent 56 years keeping this material secure, about Edward Porter who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and had trusted that someone would eventually finish what he'd started. Victor met him at the gangway with an expression that was alert and assessing. Everything is proceeding smoothly, but I notice you seem tense, Mr. Porter. Having second thoughts about our transaction? Just thinking about how $40 million will change my life, James replied, following the script Mitchell's team had prepared. It's not every day that disabled veterans become wealthy by inheriting ships from uncles they never met. No, it's not. Victor studied him for a moment longer before gesturing toward where his team was preparing to move the plutonium containers. The material will be loaded within 20 minutes, and your payment will transfer the moment we confirm secure transportation. Then you'll never see us again and you can spend your wealth however you choose. James watched the loading operation begin, seeing how carefully the specialist handled containers that could kill everyone present if breached or damaged, understanding the terrible efficiency with which these people worked toward objectives that would result in civilian deaths counted in thousands rather than individuals. He thought about pressing the panic button immediately, ending this before the material left the ship, but Mitchell's voice came through the nearly invisible earpiece he wore, steady and commanding. Hold position. We've identified 2 additional high-value targets who just arrived, including someone we've been tracking for 8 years without ever getting this close. Another 60 seconds, and we'll have everyone we need. Those 60 seconds felt infinite. James standing on the Reynolds' deck watching terrorists load weapons-grade plutonium, while tactical teams waited for the perfect moment to interdict, the weight of responsibility and timing pressing down on him with physical force. He thought about Afghanistan and combat situations where seconds determined who lived and who died, where hesitation meant disaster, but premature action meant mission failure. Execute, execute, execute. Mitchell's voice commanded through his earpiece at exactly 2:59 a.m., and suddenly the salvage yard erupted with movement and sound as tactical teams breached from 6 directions simultaneously, flashbang grenades and shouted commands and the controlled chaos of operators executing plans they'd rehearsed until every movement was automatic and precise. James dropped flat on the deck as trained. covering his head while gunfire erupted around him. Short, controlled bursts from weapons that were designed for accuracy rather than suppression. Tactical teams engaging Victor's security personnel who were returning fire with the desperation of people who knew. Capture meant life imprisonment or execution. The firefight lasted 93 seconds according to the after-action report James would read later, though in the moment, it felt both longer and shorter, time distorting under stress and adrenaline. When silence finally returned, 4 of Victor's people were dead, 7 were wounded and in custody, and 1 had escaped into the salvage yard where pursuit teams were tracking him with thermal imaging and dogs. Victor himself was alive but wounded. Dr. Kovalenko was in custody uninjured, and Dr. Ahmadi was dead from a round that had struck her during the initial breach. The irony of her dying in an operation she'd participated in willingly, apparently lost on no one except possibly her. Mitchell found James still lying on the Reynolds' deck, his ears ringing from gunfire and flashbangs, his mind processing that he'd just survived his second combat situation after believing his warfighting days had ended in Afghanistan. "You did well," she said, helping him stand. "The network's leadership is in custody and we're executing simultaneous raids in 5 other countries right now. Because of your cooperation, we've dismantled an infrastructure that's been threatening nuclear terrorism for 2 decades. James looked at the bodies being covered by forensic teams, at the wounded being treated by combat medics, at the plutonium containers that remained secured on the ship despite the violence that had erupted around them. My uncle kept this material safe for 56 years without anyone dying. I inherited it for 3 weeks, and 4 people are dead. That doesn't feel like success." "Your uncle kept it safe by hiding and paying storage fees," Mitchell replied. "You kept it safe by exposing it and helping us stop the people who would have used it to kill thousands. Different methods, different costs, but the same ultimate outcome of preventing nuclear terrorism." She paused. "Edward Porter would be proud of what you did, James. He'd understand that finishing his mission required courage he couldn't find during his lifetime, but that he correctly believed you'd possess when the time came." 6 months later, James stood in Arlington National Cemetery watching as his uncle's ashes were interred with military honors that had been denied during his lifetime, but were now granted posthumously, after classified proceedings had reviewed his actions and determined that Edward Porter's theft had been justified by circumstances and had prevented greater harm than it had caused. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by James, Mitchell, Frank DeLuca, and a handful of officers who understood what Edward had done and why recognition had taken 56 years to arrive. The medals presented during the ceremony were classified and would never be publicly displayed. Acknowledgement of service that had to remain secret because revealing it would expose security failures the Navy still preferred to keep hidden. But they were real, and they mattered to James, who accepted them on his uncle's behalf, and understood that some courage was never publicly celebrated, but was no less genuine for its anonymity. The $40 million James had been promised as bait for Victor's network never materialized because cryptocurrency transfers that were meant as evidence didn't actually happen. But the government had provided compensation for his cooperation that was substantial if less than he'd been offered by terrorists. He'd used that money to expand his restoration business, hiring other disabled veterans who needed work that accommodated their injuries, creating something that honored both his uncle's memory and his own service in ways that felt more meaningful than wealth would have been. Mitchell visited occasionally, updating him on prosecutions and intelligence developments that had flowed from the network's dismantling, explaining how operations he'd helped interdict had led to the prevention of 3 planned attacks and the identification of proliferation networks in 7 countries. The war on nuclear terrorism hadn't ended with Victor's arrest, she explained during one visit, but they'd won a significant battle and had degraded capabilities that would take decades to rebuild, if they could be rebuilt at all. James thought often about his uncle's letter, about the burden of keeping secrets and making impossible choices, about living 56 years with decisions that isolated you from family and cost you peace of mind, but that you believed were necessary to prevent greater harm. He thought about Dr. Ahmadi's comments before the interdiction, about how his cooperation was undoing his uncle's life work, and he understood now that she'd been wrong. He hadn't undone Edward Porter's work by helping interdict the network. He'd completed it, finished what his uncle had started by keeping material secure until someone with courage to expose it could ensure it never reached the hands of people who would use it to kill innocents. The theft that had seemed like a burden and a crime had revealed itself over 56 years to be something more complex, an act of conscience that had required sacrifice Edward had been willing to make even knowing he'd never receive recognition or forgiveness for choices that had seemed wrong to everyone except him. Some inheritances were measured in property and money, but others were measured in responsibility and courage, in finishing what previous generations had started and accepting burdens they'd carried so you could have the opportunity to resolve them. James had inherited a ship worth $20,000 as scrap metal, but he'd also inherited his uncle's mission and his uncle's courage, and completing that inheritance had required risking his life to stop people who would have used stolen plutonium to create exactly the kind of chaos and death that Edward Porter had spent 56 years preventing. The rusted destroyer Escort still sat in Frank DeLuca's salvage yard, the sealed compartment now truly empty, and the vessel waiting to be scrapped or restored, depending on whether James decided historical preservation was worth the investment. But every time he visited the Reynolds, he thought about the moment he'd opened that compartment and found material that changed his life, about the choice between easy money and difficult conscience, about his uncle who'd made the right choice even when it cost him everything, and had trusted that James would make the same choice when the time came. He'd been right to trust, and that trust had been honored. And sometimes that was the only legacy that mattered when the story was finished, and the secrets were finally revealed, and the burden that had been carried for 56 years was finally lifted by someone who understood that courage wasn't about recognition or reward, but about doing what was necessary even when the cost was higher than anyone should have to pay. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through nuclear secrets, impossible choices, and the courage to finish what others started. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments about whether James made the right choice. And remember, sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in money, but in the opportunity to complete missions that defined those who came before us.